Hi, everyone. This is Doug. This is a sequel to the prior episode about who is the least person, least man, who Jesus intended to identify in Matthew 5, verse 19. Now I want to talk about something that Adam Clarke concedes. He's a famous Protestant minister and also commentator, and he did a very good, thorough commentary on the book of Matthew as part of his New Testament commentary. This is book 1. And so let's take a look. Adam Clarke in 1825 says Jesus in Matthew 5:19 warns of the least one who has no salvation when read with Matthew 5 verse 20. So let's see, can he prove that? Can he prove what he's saying? Well, here's what he says. So this is therefore an addendum to what we did in the prior episode. And this is what he says. Whoever shall, the word there is relaxes, and I'm going to put it there in place of what he had, which was break, because he actually then knows it means relax, and he does a commentary based on the actual translation, correct translation. Then he says this, what an awful consideration is this? He who, by his mode of acting, speaking, or explaining the words of God, sets the holy precept aside or explains away its force and meaning shall be called least. Jesus talking about the law and prophets. He just started that in verse 17. So this is what he's referring back to. Shall have no place in the kingdom of Christ here, nor in the kingdom of glory above. That is the meaning of these words, is evident enough from the following verse, meaning Matthew 5:20. So let me read that again a little bit in just a section where he mentions this. He who, by his mode of acting, speaking, or explaining. So I would say it's mostly speaking and explaining. Acting, it could be that you act badly, but more importantly, it just says whoever teaches you to obey the God's law is great in the kingdom of heaven. And so the contrast is this person who teaches you to not obey God's law is least. So the contrast is really more about teaching. And so I'd say it's speaking or explaining the words of God, who then thereby the speaking and explaining sets the holy precept aside or explains away its force and meaning. So if you just want to make light of what it's actually saying and don't give it its correct meaning, you actually are also depriving it of its impact and meaning to guide someone in their life. That person shall be called least. That is, he says this, shall have no place in the kingdom of Christ here, nor in the kingdom of glory above. And that goes for all Pauline Christians who insist that Paul is correct to do away with the law or the food laws or whatever was prescribed for us. In Acts 15, we were given some food laws. We were given a morality law. We were told we were going to be going to Sabbath each week. That's what's in Acts 15. When you get to the very end, James is pretty obviously saying, hey, I don't need to go into more detail of what they need to do. They'll each week go to Shabbat and they will learn more. That's what it says at the end, but everybody just reads the commands and they go, oh, that's 4 commands, no big deal. No, he's anticipating we will go to Shabbat. And Jesus did too, and that's why he quotes from the passage in Isaiah 56:6-7 about us Gentiles. We have this specific narrow set of commands we must obey in order to enter the kingdom of God. At that time, now Jesus, I believe, has added a lot more commands we have to consider because they're universally stated. But what we were told in Isaiah 56:6-7 is we had to do 2 primary things to be saved. It doesn't mean you can eat whatever you want. That's not going to send you to hell. But what it was that normally, unless you eat meat, sacrifice, idols, that was a complete criminal act that is perverse, and God doesn't like that. But the point is this: if you in Isaiah 56:6-7, it says, if you keep the Shabbat from defiling it, meaning you don't work on Shabbat, you take that day off, and you keep the 10 commandments, in essence, by calling it the covenant. That means you won't, you'll honor your mother and father, you won't commit murder, you won't have another God in front of the face of Yahweh, the Father, things like that. If you do that and you don't violate those commandments, you are welcome into my holy mountain, God Yahweh says in Isaiah 56:6-7. And it was all specifically about sojourners, specifically about us. And Jesus quotes it specifically in throwing out the money changers, that God's plan is to have the Gentiles welcome in my holy mountain and have a house of prayer for all nations. And that was what was key, and that's salvation for us Gentiles. But Paul doesn't know anything about it because he said, I didn't, in Galatians 2, he says, I didn't get anything from the 12, the pillars there, so-called pillars, whoever they were, it doesn't matter to me. They're just human beings, and their titles don't mean anything to me. I get all my messages from the third heaven from my Jesus. So that's what he's banking on. And you shouldn't, because he's the one who's relaxing the commandments of God. He's taking away in Galatians the commandments of God. He says they weren't even given by God. They were given by angels, not by God. They were given by angels who are no gods, right? And he says, why do you want to be in bondage again to the weak and beggarly elements? And the word there, elements, is really the word for spiritual beings who control the elements. Vincent explains in his commentary, and Marvin Vincent is as normative as you can come as a Protestant commentator and translator. Anyway, continuing. Shall have no place in the kingdom of Christ here, nor in the kingdom of glory above. That is the meaning of these words, is evident enough from the following verse, Matthew 5:20. So now we got to look at 5:20, why 5:20 compels this conclusion, because it involves the Pharisees, as we'll see. All right, so we're going to always use Mousy typically, because you can almost guarantee 90% of the time that all the mistakes or erroneous knowledge of Greek and prior ancestors back in 1611, this has all been corrected and upgraded, so we can see most of the mistakes. Not all of them, but most of them. Anyway, this is what Mousy has. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments, so relaxes the true meaning of Leo, and teaches others to do the same, will be called least by the kingdom of heaven. So the person isn't in the kingdom of heaven, but she'll be called least by the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches others, the person will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Then it continues. For I tell you that unless your righteousness exceeds beyond that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So a lot of explanations have been offered that this isn't real, that you don't have to worry about this. But you're going to see Jesus says a lot about the Pharisees that you're misinformed about as a Christian, and Protestant particularly, and your pastors don't want to tell you about it because it goes against the grain of their doctrine. Let's take a look. Now let's find out who is the one who taught us that the Pharisees are strict. Did Jesus say they were strict? So this is the question I posit here in the slide. Why does Protestant Christianity have a 180-degree wrong view of Pharisees as legalists? Right? If you were to use the word legalist, you would say immediately you're talking about the Pharisees, when the answer is absolutely not. They're the opposite of legalists. They're people who undermine God's law. They turn you away from it. They are the category least in that passage we just saw. So they fit that just as much as Paul does, okay? And that's why Paul creates a false image here in Acts 22, verse 3, of what is the nature of the Pharisees. Now, you're going to say, well, why is Luke repeating this? Well, Luke is defending Paul in an appeal, and that's what this is intended for. Oh, most excellent Theophilus is how he's addressing a judge. Twice, other places in the book of Acts, only in reference to two judges. Both times it's called most excellent Festus, most excellent Felix. So when you see most excellent Theophilus in the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 1, and when you see it in the book of Luke 1, verses 1 to 3, you know he's writing a compendium to send to the magistrate judge who's hearing the appeal that is pending for Paul. He made an appeal to Caesar, and he's having to travel all the way to Rome, and he's on that ship, and he lives there for a couple of years, and Luke is recording all these events to get you prepared that there's going to be an appeal coming up. Well, who? Is it for us? No, it wasn't meant for Christians. It was meant for the magistrate judge, Theophilus. He is the guy who's going to he's going to assist Nero in making the decision. There's a lot of evidence on that, and we've covered that in many videos, but that's a thing that people have to see the context. So he includes all kinds of stories that makes Paul look good. So he lets Paul say, hey, you're going to see, he's going to say, I was educated to keep the strictness of ancestral law. Okay, so let's take a listen to it. Acts 22, verse 3. I am a Jewish man, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel. He was the head of the Pharisees, by the way. Educated according to the strictness of ancestral law, being zealous for God, just as you all are today. He's addressing the Pharisees. Okay. Now, that made or gave an impression to people that you could say the Pharisees were strict. And now he's breaking away. He's becoming a Christian. He doesn't have to keep the strict nature of the law. In fact, there is no more law. There's no more Jew or Gentile, and there's just no law at all. And you can eat whatever you want. In Romans, he says there's nothing wrong as long as you say a blessing over it. It's all good. Okay. Now, I found an article that generally is pretty good called Two Pathways by Jacob Gerber. And he wrote this in February of 2022. And the title of it was Beware the Leaven of the Pharisees. Now, Jesus said that, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. So the Pharisees are people you want to avoid, and what they teach you want to avoid. And you're going to say, well, Doug, you're the legalist. I'm not a legalist. I just told you what the Ten Commandments was and how to get saved according to Isaiah 56. It's not a mountain of 613 commandments, is it? No, to be saved. Okay, now you have some other commands in food categories that you should do and have to do. Sometimes God says that. But that's a specific rule usually has to be identified about us. And we're called sojourners or foreigners, depending on the translation, in the Law and the Prophets. So let's now take a look. What's wrong with the Pharisees? Are they too strict? No. He says this, the Pharisees are not too strict, but they're too lax. That's what Jesus found fault with them. They were not legalists. Legalism means you strictly teach people to keep the law. The Pharisees are not too strict, but they're too lax. And this is what he says. The Pharisees were trying to reduce the law down to something manageable in the lives of the people. That's Paul to a T. Not only manageable, but like non-existent. This did not lead them to I think he meant to say did not lead them to become too strict, but far too lax in comparison to the fullness of what God required. So in other words, the Pharisees were not telling you, here's all the commands and here's what you need to follow and telling you how to do it. No, they were trying to find a way that you wouldn't have to worry about doing it, and they would be minimizing it and changing it and altering it so it'd be easy, very easy. And what did Jesus say? The path to destruction is the easy path, but the way that leads to life is difficult, and few there are that find it. So this is just by definition. Once you know the nature of the Pharisees is not strict, but is lax, then you can finally figure out what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about people like Paul and where Paul came from. He claims he was a Pharisee, and he even says, I am a Pharisee in Acts 22 when he gets up and gives a speech. He's saying in present tense, I am a Pharisee. Jesus said, beware the leaven, the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. They put on two faces. They'll appear as if they are teaching the law, but they're not. Then when you go behind the curtain, they're not really who they say they are. They're teaching you to be relaxed about the law and not follow the law, follow their customs, but not the law of God. Now, I just want to show you, this is a passage here, 5:19, therefore whoever relaxes one of the least of these commands. Now, let's take that word relaxes in Matthew 5:19 and just draw it right up here. This is what Jacob said. Not too strict, but too lax. The Pharisees are too lax. Jesus will demonstrate that in a minute. And therefore, when you see in Matthew 5:19, the work of the least one is he or she or whoever it is relaxes one of the least of these commandments is called the least. So that means the Pharisees as a group, and Paul specifically as who he is, are people who relax the law to make it as easy as possible. In fact, Paul makes it all about just believing the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and you're saved. And, I have to just really push you guys and say, hey, if I said you're saved if you believe Lazarus rose from the dead, because that's all he's saying. Jesus didn't do anything but died, resurrected, and rose from the dead, and that's going to save you. That's 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4. That's salvation. And that's what Billy Graham preached over and over again in the 90s when I was listening to him. He really changed from the guy I knew in the 1970s. He was very normative then, but then by 1990s, it was just all about 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4. Simply, if I created a new religion saying if you believe Lazarus died, was buried, and resurrected, would you be saved? What would be the reason that you would be saved? Because of those facts. Facts don't save you. Knowledge or gnosis of facts don't save you. That's what James points out. But that's what Paul had made it all about. But therefore, by doing that, he relaxed the entire law. None of it's relevant to your salvation anymore. Just believing in three literal facts of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and you shall be saved. He uses that promise. So let's continue. And Jesus deals with another issue of what the Pharisees did, which is by adding to the law things that weren't there, that were unnecessary, they were then burdening people with obligations they don't have. So this is another thing that Paul does, and we'll get to that in a second. well, I'll just show you what I'm talking about. Paul says women must be silent in church and cannot teach a man. That's not in the law, but that's a new obligation. But it's not in the law, and this fits right in here with what Jesus condemns. Listen to this. This is the title of the slide. Jesus taught Pharisees violated God's law by also adding unnecessary burdens not mandated in the law, for example, hand washing before home meals. So I ran that through AI. That was my recollection. It says, yes, Jesus does address hand washing before meals in the Gospels, particularly Matthew 15 and Mark 7. And Jesus indicates that the ritual hand washing practiced by the Pharisees is not required by God's law and is unnecessary. To be more precise, it's not required for you and me. When the priest goes into the temple and he's doing the sacrifices and all that, he has to wash his hands. Then the Pharisees thought that ritual purity for purposes of the temple should be extended to the people who are trying to just eat lunch at home. And that's not what the law said. And so Jesus is fighting back against that and saying, you're making up traditions and putting burdens on people they don't have to do. And you could see how that could create a lot of problems if you're in a place where there's no water to clean your hands with, but you want to eat some food. What are you supposed to do? Like run around until you can find a lake or river nearby and until you can wash your hands, or you have to carry water bottles wherever you go and then spend that precious water on cleaning your hands rather than drinking it. I mean, this is the nonsense to which they had put the people. And Jesus is basically fighting against that hand washing rule because it's not in the law. It's not in the law as to people at home trying to get by. It only applies to the priest in the ritual sacrifice they'd have to do in the temple. They do have to wash their hands there. Now, next, I did already give a preview on this, but this slide is entitled, Paul did the same thing by adding unnecessary things, burdening people, claiming a woman must be silent in church and cannot teach a man. And by the way, he actually says it was in the law, and I researched it, and you know where that law was? It's on the side of the temple at Delphi. It was a pagan temple that had the law that a man shall rule over a woman, and you must practice ritual silence, meaning in the temples. So this is the only place I could find anything similar to that. So the man could rule over the woman, and then it said you had to be ritually silent during ritual practices. But there's nowhere in the law these things ever existed. In the law of Moses, the law given by Yahweh to Moses. So where does Paul get that from? But that's a whole nother issue. The real problem is Paul is adding burdens, very severe burdens on women. I mean, seriously, there was a period of time where women in the Baptist church, if you study the history of the Baptist church, where the women became pastors. And I'm not endorsing pastors because Jesus is our sole pastor. So I think the whole system of pastors is wrong anyway. We should all be equal, brothers and sisters. And anybody who has some message that they can bring and they've studied on it, should be able to talk about it. But otherwise, it's there is no pastor system. But anyway, the point I'm trying to get to is the women were rising up and doing pastoring. So let's just not say they were named pastor, but they just wanted to do pastoring, basically give teachings and help people. Let's say the men are so busy with work and they don't have time to study the Word of God, but the women know all about it. Why shouldn't they be allowed to teach? Honestly, that's true. Why shouldn't they be teaching men and women? And that's a real difficulty for women, right? So, and it hobbles the church, if you ask me. And I also think we don't realize that women have their own interests that they need to talk about. And we should know what it is. It shouldn't be the women have to all go in a group all by themselves. We should hear what they're saying. And it should be a common group so that we can even dialogue with them. So Paul forced this unnatural division so that the women are talking without us in the same room and we don't know what they're thinking. And the one thing, guys, we need to know is we need to know what our wives are thinking, so we could, be prepared to, answer their questions and talk to them reasonably. So anyway, but Paul does the exact same thing that the Pharisees do. They added an unnecessary burden not mandated in the law. Paul put an unnecessary burden on women that they must be silent in church and cannot teach a man. Unnecessary, not in the law. But yet he actually made it clear this is something you must do. All right, so when we get back to our now conclusion, is simply this, is that Matthew 5:19, talking about the least, clearly indicates that individual has no salvation. And if you fall into that camp and you're following Paul, you're going to have no salvation. I'm just being blunt with you. Your righteousness has to exceed that of the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were very shallow in their adherence to the law. They were teaching it very shallowly, and they were trying to make it very easy and make it very not difficult for people to call themselves Jews, and yet they don't have to really follow the law. You're being told you can be a Christian and you don't have to have any law. You don't have to keep Shabbat. You don't have to keep the Ten Commandments. That's what it's being told. I want to close here by showing you a commentary by Luther on Galatians. This was 1536. This is before he wrote the Antinomian Theses, and this is how rigid he was that you shouldn't obey any of the law. And he's talking about verse 27 in Galatians chapter 4. All right, so now listen to this and tell me if he doesn't fit in the category clearly of what Jesus condemned as the least, those who teach you to relax the law. Not only relax the law, see how far it really goes. Based on Galatians, Luther says this: the law, the old husband, is really dead. But not all people know it or want to know it. They labor and bear the burden in the heat of the day and bring forth many children, children that are bastards like themselves, children born to be put out of the house like Ishmael, to perish forever. Accursed be that doctrine, life, and religion which endeavors to obtain righteousness before God by the law and its creeds. Well, no wonder Luther's going to sneer at the Ten Commandments that are here, because in the Ten Commandments, between the first and second commandment, God says, I extend mercy to those who love me and obey my commandments. Mercy means forgiveness. Mercy means salvation. You have to love God and obey his commandments. That's the condition of salvation in the Ten Commandments. It's never going away. Jesus said not one jot or tittle will go away. Paul can't do away with it. Nobody can relax these requirements. That's a false gospel. That's the false gospel, not the gospel that I'm trying to share with you that Jesus is teaching. Now let's keep listening to Luther, because it gets worse. The scholastics think that the judicial and ceremonial laws of Moses were abolished by the coming of Christ, but not the moral law. So now he's going to go after the things that are right and wrong, adultery, idolatry, all these commandments that are moral. They are blind. When Paul declares that we are delivered from the curse of the law, he means the whole law, particularly the moral law, which more than the other laws accuses, curses, it condemns the conscience. The Ten Commandments have no right to condemn that conscience in which Jesus dwells, for Jesus has taken from the Ten Commandments the right and power to curse us. Oh my goodness me. Now, as shocking as that all was, are you sitting down in a place where you won't fall over, fall out of your chair? Because Luther repented all of that. Luther repented of his Paulinism. Luther condemned everything that Paul taught later in time. That's what you're never told. And that is a hidden part of the Protestant Reformation, that he repented of his Paulinism in a work called the Antinomian Theses. And this is written in 1539, collected as a writing. And then ultimately, through his influence with Melanchthon, and Melanchthon continued the mission at his death to actually change the congregation he had created, which was more powerful than himself. He couldn't change it by direct decree. He had to simply try to win a vote among the sola fides who had dominated the church, because he had created it on that premise. And now he had to reverse gears, and Luther did, but he died too soon before he could see his fruit. But ultimately, Melanchthon changed the mission of the Lutheran Church, and he did that with the help of George Major in what's called the Majoristic Controversy in 1555. And ultimately, by 1580, though, when Melanchthon had died, it was reversed back to the faith alone doctrine. But until then, it was called the double justification doctrine, and you were saved initially by faith, but you had to have works worthy of repentance and good works as Jesus demanded. And that was the new doctrine of the Lutheran Church from 1555 to 1580. So let me just read you something, because it will, like I said, you might fall out of your chair if you read this carefully. And this is an AI answer. When did Luther write the Antinomian Theses? And then it volunteers what that was about. Martin Luther did not write the Antinomian Theses as a single named document. Instead, his writings and disputations on this topic, which he engaged in from 1537 to 1539. Now, I want you to notice that date, 1537. When did he write the book of his commentary in Galatians, which said those horrific things about the Ten Commandments? 1536. And I'm going to tell you, I believe by him seeing the own disgust that he would ultimately have revulsion if he had the Holy Spirit, is what he just wrote there was the most horrific anti-law apostasy imaginable. That even the moral law is gone. Everything about the Ten Commandments, we just do whatever we want. We believe we're in the Spirit. We avoid the letter. It kills us. And he totally rejected it. In 1537 through 1539, he involved himself in a series of disputations with his pupil, Agricola, who said, hey, you are going against anymore. Where are you, Luther? You've got to stand up again for faith alone. And he said, no. He said, no. This was his answers. Luther's key work on this topic was against the antinomians. Nomos is the Torah. He was against the anti-Torah people. He is woken up and he's awake. And this was published in 1539. And it was the response to the antinomian teachings of John Agricola or Agricola, depending on how you'd like to pronounce things. Now let's take a look at this summary. Just they elaborate a little bit so you get a little more taste. Luther's writings against antinomianism, meaning anti-Torah, arose from his disagreement with figures like John Agricola, who advocated for a view that minimized the importance of the law in the Christian life. What had he just done? Luther himself, 1 year earlier before this disputation. He himself did not only minimize it, he erased it 100%. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, this fundamental change and shift in Luther's mind, which should be amazingly influential in Protestantism today, has been completely ignored and completely wiped out. Do you realize history in real time has been rewritten so you can't hear it? It's not that it didn't exist or can't be found out. It's just suppressed and never talked about. And it's an embarrassment to the Protestants who believe in the faith alone doctrine that somebody as great as Luther, the guy who founded their very movement, changed and reversed course. Do you see, ladies and gentlemen, what Doug is telling you is not crazy stuff. It's exactly what is truth. And Luther knew it, and his successor, Melanchthon, knew it. And the Lutherans of that day changed it. But the Solovidists were more numerous, and they changed it back to faith alone. Now, I want you to see something what Jesus says about this kind of behavior that you see happened in the 1580s when the Book of Concord, the Book of Peace, we're going to now have peace. We're no longer going to have a conflict over faith alone. It's just all going to be agreed it's faith alone. Jesus addresses this doctrine of faith alone. It's an easy way, my friends. If you just had to believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4, you're going to heaven just by believing some facts about Jesus, that he died, he was buried, and rose again. What does that matter? Seriously, why would God give you salvation for just believing some facts? This gnosis. So anyway, Jesus addresses the easy way, this faith alone way. It's another way of saying the same thing. That leads to destruction versus a path that leads to life. Matthew 7, verses 13-14, English Standard Version. Enter by the narrow gate, and really means strive to enter by the narrow gate, like use all your energy. For the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. Remember, easy, destruction. Keep those words in your mind. And those who enter it by it are many, many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are numerous. The majority, the great overwhelming number will find it. No, the few will find it. So don't say, Doug, you're just this little minority, little group over here. Nobody's going to pay attention to you. Hey, it doesn't matter how many people agree with me. It's what did Jesus say? It's what did Jesus say, and what did he mean? And he said his words would not pass away. The heavens and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And you are part of a mission now against him if you're inside of standard Protestant Christianity, to suppress the truth, to suppress what Luther said. I would definitely be interested to see, would some Protestant church, in response to this video, say, hey, you know what? We're going to investigate Luther's change of heart. Did he really change his heart? Yes, he did. And why did he do that? And what was his convincing arguments in the book Antinomian Theses? At one point, he says, if you say the law has been done away with, that's like you don't know what you're saying. It's like a parrot who speaks and says, hello, how are you? And it's just, it doesn't know it's actually saying those words. He says you're speaking without any intelligent thought coming from your brain. It's just you're repeating a parrot. You're parroting what people have told you, but you haven't actually thought it all through. Actually, I think it's one of the greatest comments of Luther ever, that people who repeat the faith alone doctrine are simply parroting something without thinking. That's what he was saying. It was one of the greatest pieces of literature ever written when he said that crushing analysis of his own doctrine that he created himself. he brought to life in the 1517. So it only took him 19 years to realize he was wrong. Do you see, ladies and gentlemen? But he was willing to change and willing to do everything he could to change the church back to what was the correct thing, but he died before he could accomplish it. That's what happened. But his heir to the leadership or his position within the church went to Melanchthon, and that man was able, with the help of George Major, to reverse the entire doctrine of the church and turn it back to Christ's doctrine, which they were using this new label, the double justification doctrine. So it wasn't as completely as embarrassing as it sounds. Oh, well, you're saved initially by faith, but then the next moment you need to have a salvation is now by works, because that's where if you read Jesus, that's what you logically will conclude is next. All right. I hope that helps everybody. God bless. Ciao.